Scary telling.
I woke up feeling disoriented, my head throbbing with pain. I tried to sit up, but something was pulling me back down. That's when I noticed the magnets implanted in my abdomen and the weight of the person next to me. I turned my head to see Garrett lying next to me, his eyes closed and his breathing shallow. I shook him gently, trying to wake him up, but he didn't respond. Panic began to rise in my chest as I looked around the room and realized we were in a strange shack with no idea how we got there. Suddenly, a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, holding a gun in his hand. He smiled sinisterly as he approached us, and my heart began to race with fear. "Welcome to your new home," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. "My name is David, and I'll be your host for the foreseeable future." I tried to ask him what he wanted from us, but my voice came out as a weak croak. He ignored me and began to explain that he had been watching us for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. He had implanted neodymium magnets in our abdomens, which he could control with a remote, causing us to experience excruciating pain whenever he pleased. My mind raced as I tried to process what was happening. Why had he chosen us? What did he want from us? And how were we going to escape? David seemed to read my thoughts because he laughed and said, "Don't bother trying to escape. You're in the middle of nowhere, and there's no way out. The nearest highway is 20 miles away, and I've taken all the precautions to make sure you can't leave." He gestured to the door, which had been reinforced with heavy locks and chains. There were no windows, no escape routes, and no hope. Over the next few days, David kept us drugged and disoriented, never leaving us alone for long. He forced us to perform sexual acts on each other, depriving us of food and water, and locking us in separate rooms for days on end. The neodymium magnets provided an additional layer of torture, causing us to experience excruciating pain whenever David pleased. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, we began to lose hope. We had no idea how long we had been captive, or what was happening in the outside world. Our only focus was on surviving each day, and trying to keep each other alive. The magnets in our abdomens became a constant reminder of our captivity and the control that David had over us. We couldn't escape, we couldn't fight back, and we couldn't even be apart from each other. We were trapped, physically and emotionally, with no way out. I remember feeling a sense of despair and hopelessness, wondering if we would ever be able to escape, or if this was our life now. As we lay there in the shack, with nothing but the sound of our own breathing and the occasional sound of David's footsteps, we knew that we were in for a long and terrifying journey. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and David's visits became more frequent and more violent. He would come in and out of the shack, taunting us with promises of escape, and then subjecting us to horrific abuses that left us physically and emotionally broken. At first, he would force us to perform sexual acts on each other, watching us with a sadistic glee as we begged for mercy. He would deprive us of food and water, and leave us locked in separate rooms for days on end. The pain and the fear were constant, and we began to lose all sense of time. But the worst torture of all was the neodymium magnets. David had implanted them in our abdomens, ensuring that we would always be connected to each other. He could control the magnets with a remote, causing us to experience excruciating pain whenever he pleased. He would do it for hours on end, until we were curled up in balls, sobbing and begging for him to stop. I remember feeling like I was losing my mind, like I was in a never-ending nightmare that I couldn't escape from. Every time David entered the shack, my heart would race with fear, wondering what he had in store for us next. Garrett and I would try to comfort each other as best we could, but it was hard to find solace in each other's pain. We were both broken, physically and emotionally, and it seemed like there was no way out. One day, David came into the room with a strange device in his hand. He explained that it was a shock collar, and that he was going to use it on us if we didn't obey him. "You've been disobedient lately," he said with a cruel smile. "So I need to teach you a lesson." He put the collars around our necks, and I remember feeling a jolt of electricity run through my body as he turned them on. The pain was intense, and I screamed out in agony. David laughed at our pain and then left us alone in the room, connected by the magnets and trapped by the shock collars. It was one of the lowest points of my captivity, and I remember feeling like there was no hope left. As the days turned into months, our bodies began to wither away from lack of food and water. Our minds were fractured from the constant torture, and we could barely remember what life was like before David took us. But even in the midst of all the pain and the suffering, there was a glimmer of hope. Garrett and I had grown closer, bound together by our shared trauma. We tried to find moments of joy in each other's company, even if it was just a small smile or a touch of the hand. It was the only thing that kept us going, the only thing that made us feel like we were still human beings, and not just pieces of flesh and bone trapped in a shack in the middle of nowhere. As the months turned into years, something began to shift inside me. At first, I didn't notice it, but slowly, I began to feel a sense of attachment to David. It was a confusing and terrifying feeling, but I couldn't deny that I felt some sort of sympathy for my captor. It was a form of Stockholm Syndrome, I realized, a psychological phenomenon where captives develop feelings of affection for their captors as a survival mechanism. In a strange way, it made sense. David was the only person we had contact with, and the only source of comfort in our lives. It was easier to try and find some sort of connection with him, rather than constantly fighting against him. Garrett seemed to be experiencing the same thing, and we began to find solace in each other's company and in the strange relationship we had developed with David. It was a twisted version of a family, with David as the controlling patriarch and Garrett and I as his loyal subjects. We would do whatever he wanted, just to avoid the pain and the punishment that came with disobedience. Sometimes, David would let us sit outside in the sunshine or give us a small amount of food to share. These were the moments when we felt most human, when we could almost forget that we were captive. But even in these moments of respite, the magnets in our abdomens and the shock collars around our necks were a constant reminder of our captivity. We were still trapped, still under David's control, and still in constant fear of what he would do next. As the years went by, David's visits became less frequent. He would come in once a week, then once a month, and then once every few months. But even when he wasn't there, we were still connected to him through the magnets and the collars, and his presence loomed over us like a dark cloud. It was during these times, when David was absent, that Garrett and I would try to find small moments of joy. We would talk about our lives before we were taken, sharing memories of our families and our friends. We would make plans for the future, even though we both knew that there was no way out of our captivity. And in these moments, I would feel a strange sense of gratitude towards David. He had given us each other, in a strange way, and he had kept us alive for all these years. It was a sick and twisted version of love, but it was all we had. As I lay there, connected to Garrett by the neodymium magnets and trapped in a never-ending nightmare, I knew that I had to hold on to this strange sense of connection, or else I would lose my mind completely. One day, David came into the room with a duffel bag and a strange look on his face. He told us that he was leaving for good, that he had found a new couple to kidnap and torture, and that he had no more use for us. "We've had a good run," he said with a cruel smile. "But all good things must come to an end." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving us alone and connected by the neodymium magnets. I remember feeling a sense of disbelief and despair wash over me. This was all I had known for years, and now it was being taken away from me. Garrett and I huddled together, unsure of what to do next. We knew that we couldn't survive on our own, not after years of captivity and torture. And we had no idea where we were, or how to find our way back to civilization. Days turned into weeks, and we tried to keep each other alive with what little resources we had. We would talk about our memories of life before we were taken, trying to hold on to some sense of normalcy. But the reality of our situation was impossible to ignore. We were in the middle of nowhere, with no food or water, and surrounded by dangers like mountain lions and rattlesnakes. It was during these times that I began to feel a sense of regret for the strange sense of attachment I had developed towards David. He had been our captor, our abuser, and yet part of me still felt like we owed him something. But as the days went on, and we were left to fend for ourselves, I began to feel a sense of anger and bitterness towards him. How could he just abandon us like this, after all the years he had kept us captive? How could he be so heartless? Garrett and I would try to make plans for escape, but it was impossible. We were too weak, too tired, and too disoriented to even think about finding our way back to civilization. We were trapped, in every sense of the word. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and I began to feel like we were living in a never-ending nightmare. The magnets in our abdomens and the shock collars around our necks were a constant reminder of our captivity and the fact that we had no control over our lives. As time passed, our bodies began to wither away from lack of food and water. Our minds were fractured from the constant torture, and we could barely remember what life was like before David took us. And yet, even in the midst of all this suffering, there was a strange sense of comfort in being with Garrett. We had been through so much together, and we knew each other's pain intimately. It was a bond that could never be broken, even in the face of death. As I lay there, connected to Garrett by the neodymium magnets, and surrounded by the desolate landscape of our captivity, I knew that this was where we would spend the rest of our lives. There was no escape, no rescue, and no hope. We were abandoned, left to die in a forgotten corner of the world. I don't know how long we were stranded in the wilderness. Time seemed to lose all meaning, and every day was a struggle to survive. But one day, something miraculous happened. We heard the sound of an engine in the distance, and we knew that we had been saved. It was a group of hikers who had stumbled upon our shack. They found us weak and disoriented, but alive. They called for help, and soon enough we were airlifted to a hospital. It was a surreal experience, being surrounded by doctors and nurses and people who were trying to help us. We were free, after all these years of captivity and torture. But the freedom came with a heavy price. Our bodies were weak and frail, and we had to undergo months of physical therapy just to be able to walk again. The emotional scars were even harder to heal. We were haunted by the memories of what had happened to us, and we struggled to find our place in the world again. But even in the midst of all this pain, there was a sense of hope. Garrett and I had each other, and we had survived the unthinkable. We were alive, and we were free. The trial of David was a long and painful process. We had to relive the trauma all over again, recounting every detail of our captivity to a jury of strangers. But we were determined to see justice done, and we stood by each other through every moment of the trial. When the verdict came down, and David was sentenced to life in prison, there was a sense of closure. We could finally begin to move on with our lives, and try to heal from the trauma that we had endured. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when we felt like we would never fully recover. But we kept pushing forward, together, and slowly but surely, we began to rebuild our lives. Years have passed since we were rescued from that shack in the wilderness. Garrett and I are still together, and we are stronger than ever. We have a family now, and a home that we have built together. But we will never forget the years that we spent in captivity and the horrors that we endured. It has shaped us in ways that we can never fully understand, but it has also given us a sense of strength and resilience that we never knew we had. As I look back on those years, I am filled with a strange mix of sadness and gratitude. It was a nightmare that I would never wish on anyone, but it was also a journey that brought me closer to the person that I love. And in the end, that's all that matters.